Welcome to the RAOB program's Hodograph Options Storm Motion tab. The following examples are only available with the optional Hodograph and Interactive module. Here we have the standard Hodograph view. Now we'll call up the Hodograph Options panel by going to the Options menu and then select Diagram Options. Before going to the Storm Motion tab, first notice that this hodograph represents the 0 to 6 kilometer sounding depth. And now we'll select the Storm Motion tab, which will be used for the rest of this video. We'll first turn on the Plot Storm Motion Vector, which is drawn in a brown color. It is also labeled below the diagram, and it is defined in the title line above the hodograph. Okay, let's also turn on the Plot Storm Layer Mean Wind Vector, which is drawn in an olive color. It is also labeled below the diagram, and we can see that the storm layer mean wind is defined in the parameter list just below the diagram. And if we drop down to the Automatic Storm Motion Prediction Method section, we see that the traditional storm motion method is currently in use. And this method calculates the storm motion vector as being 30 degrees to the right of the mean wind and 75% of the speed of the mean wind. So let's take a look. The mean wind has an angle of 249 degrees and the storm vector is at 279 degrees. And as expected, it's a 30-degree difference. And the speed of the mean wind is 35 knots, where 75% of 35 knots equals 26.25, or the 26 knots as indicated by the storm motion vector. Regardless of the hodograph wind data, this storm relationship holds true, and we can demonstrate this by first closing the Options panel, and then select any hodograph wind to click and drag it. And we can see both the mean wind and the storm motion vectors simultaneously change in response to the changing wind. And note that the same 30-degree offset and the 75% speed reduction relationships are maintained at all times. When done, we can return to the original hodograph by clicking the Restore menu option like this. Before recalling the Diagram Options panel, let's go to RAOB's Program Options to see where the storm motion relationships are initially configured. To do this, we'll go to the Options menu, then select Program Options, and then select the Algorithm Options tab. And here we can see the Traditional Method option, and the same vector relationships of 30 degrees and the 75% steering flow speed. And notice that the steering flow depth can also be configured here. So let's go ahead and close this configuration panel and recall the Hodograph Options panel by right-clicking the mouse. Now let's again look at the traditional storm method, where the same 30-degree and 75% steering flow values are displayed. And just above is an optional button called Configure Storm Layer. So guess where this button takes you? Well, let's click it and find out. Well, how about that? It takes us directly back to the Algorithm Options tab of the Program Configuration Options panels. And as long as we're back here, let's change the storm motion to the Bunkers method. And notice that now only the steering flow layer is an option. So let's click the OK button and return back to the hodograph. And now we can see that the Bunkers method is now also reflected on the Hodograph Options panel. And the storm motion vector has also been updated on the diagram. We can see this difference by selecting the traditional method and then back to the Bunkers method. And we'll show this difference one more time. Before continuing, we should note that the traditional and Bunkers storm motion vectors shown so far are designated as right-moving vectors, which is why those brown storm motion vectors were always plotted to the right of the olive-colored mean wind vector. Okay, let's now turn on the Bunkers option to also plot the left-moving storm motion vector and then apply it. And now we see that the left moving vector is drawn in a magenta color. Also notice that the labels below the diagram have changed, where RM means right moving and LM means left moving. And when we interactively alter a hodograph wind, all three vectors simultaneously change. And when done making changes, we'll again use the Restore menu option to reset the hodograph. Okay, we'll again recall the Options panel, and this time we'll turn on the Plot the top and bottom 0.5 kilometer layer vectors. These boundary vectors are used by the Bunkers method to define the left and right moving store motion vectors. So we'll apply this change, and now we can see plotted in gray colors the lower and upper boundary vectors. Alright, let's reduce the number of diagram vectors by switching back to the traditional store motion and turning off the mean wind vector and apply it. For our last example, we'll look at the method options and select the manual method. Note that a data entry box becomes active, and it is preloaded with the previously defined traditional store motion vector values. And when we apply this change, the above diagram title changes, indicating use of the manual method. And just to show how it works, let's change the speed value from 26 to 60 knots. And then apply it, and there's our 60 knot vector. So let's go ahead and close the Options panel and see what happens when we interactively alter a hodograph wind. And as expected, nothing happens to the store motion vector because it has been manually set and is not dependent on actual wind data. However, we can interactively change the storm vector by clicking on the vector's arrowhead like this. And now we can see all the respective hodograph parameters that are listed below the diagram automatically update with the storm vector change. And when we're done making these changes, we can restore the storm vector with this reset option. We'll open the Options panel one last time for a final note about the storm motion vector. As you can see, we are currently back to the automatic method. It's important to note that you don't have to activate this manual option to alter the storm motion vector. You can do it graphically. To demonstrate, we'll close the Options panel and just click and drag the vector's arrowhead like this. And as before, just use the reset option to return to the automatic method. And one more time. That completes the Hodograph Options Store Motion tab demonstration. Thank you for watching.